Welcome to Monograph Matters. I'm talking today with Christopher Browning, author of the SRCD Monograph on place-based developmental research, conceptual and methodological advances in studying youth development in context. This discussion focuses on activity space. Chris, what is an activity space and how is it different from neighborhood?
Yeah, thanks. Uh, we think about an activity space as the set of places or locations that individuals come into contact with as a result of their everyday routine activities, which sounds pretty straightforward, but it's actually not the conceptualization that has typically been used if you think about the broad sweep of research on, say, non-home exposures and youth development. Most of the time in that literature, and I'm talking about research that goes back 100 years or so, the residential neighborhood has been the proxy for everyday exposure for youth. And there are various ways that folks have gone about measuring that residential environment, but it's typically involved some kind of administrative unit, like a census unit, a census block group, which is about 1,000 people, and the boundary around that the U.S. Census sets, or a census tract, which is about 4,000 people. That's about the most common definition of a residential neighborhood that is used in the literature. And I certainly came out of that tradition. I'm a sociologist interested in developmental outcomes. And there are hundreds, perhaps thousands of papers that use that census unit or something close to it as a proxy for a non-home exposure for youth. And the typical strategy that has been used is to take characteristics of that unit, be it a poverty level or some aspect of the built environment or something else, and then link it to an outcome of developmental interest. My concern, having done a lot of that kind of work, was that we don't know what the relevance of that unit really is in the everyday lives of youth. And the notion of an activity space, thinking about where kids go on a regular basis, actually tracking those exposures and then determining what their broader activity space looks like. And that could be defined by an area that they encompass through those locations and the travel between them. And there are many different operationalizations of the activity space, but we've tended to focus on the locations themselves and then characteristics of those locations, and then determining what exposures and how exposures may be relevant in the lives of youth.
Chris, how do you incorporate activity space in your work? What can developmental scientists do in their work to seriously consider activity space?
So, using an activity space definition of exposure, particularly in contrast to a residential neighborhood exposure, allows us to determine how youth exposures on a daily basis may vary. And many of the other authors have looked at things like exposure to violence or exposure to disadvantage in their everyday lives, and how this may be linked with outcomes such as stress and mental health and so on. And we have focused on that aspect of activity space. But what we first wanted to do before looking at the outcomes of exposures was to actually determine the relevance of key contexts in everyday life. So when we first started out in 2014 was when we first went into the field to collect data from a sample of about 1,400 youth using social surveys in home and then collecting data on a smartphone, both GPS and ecological momentary assessment. We took the GPS data and then tracked where our youth went, and this is an urban sample from the Columbus, Ohio area, over the course of a week, and then asked the very basic question, how much time do youth spend in their conventionally defined neighborhood? And to that point, we couldn't really find very reliable information on that question. So we took the most common definition of a neighborhood, the census tract, about 4,000 people, and then figured out when the youth was outside the home, and then determined how much time they were spending in their home neighborhood and outside their home neighborhood. And it turned out that youth are spending about 6% of their waking time in their home census tract. So if we use that definition, that conventional definition of the neighborhood, youth are spending about 55 minutes in their home neighborhood of their waking day. The rest of the time is divided between home, about 60% of their time, and then 34% outside their home neighborhood. So research looking at residential context effects on outcomes, assuming that that context is a good proxy for exposures, are missing a substantial amount of time that's spent outside the neighborhood. And one would have to assume that that's not relevant or identical in characteristics to the home neighborhood in order for home neighborhood to be a good proxy for non-home exposures. So, and in fact, from that analysis, we extended it to determine whether kids who are living in high poverty neighborhoods were spending more or less time in the home neighborhood, or high violence neighborhoods, and so on, and determined that the poverty level of the community did actually affect the amount of time in home neighborhoods. So youth spent even less time in their home neighborhood if they lived in a high poverty neighborhood. And that was mainly accounted for by the fact that those communities are higher violence and have fewer institutions. Higher violence in a neighborhood tends to push time into the home, and fewer institutions tends to push time outside the neighborhood, not surprisingly. So that's one example of how we've used activity space in particular to shed light on the relevance of residential contexts, again, conventionally defined, as an important developmental setting. That's not to say the residential context is not important. We may just want to consider other spaces as well when talking about exposures we think matter in kids' lives.
Read more about this topic in the monograph issue, Place-Based Developmental Research, Conceptual and Methodological Advances in Studying Youth Development in Context, by Witherspoon, White, Bámaca, et al. If you like this video, consider watching our Monograph Matters playlist. For additional resources related to this and other issues of the monographs of the Society for Research in Child Development, please visit monographmatters.srcd.org.